started since it is a longer read and slightly technical. 2 more minutes. All right, let's get started. Nathan, why don't we start with you and go up?
Sure. So I did not get finished here. I'm kind of like looking a little bit at the DID section, and I've been skipping around. I mean, my general impression. I mean, this hasn't actually done a lot to change my general impression of it. Like, it's almost like if you think of, it's like blockchain. It's like somewhere between blockchain and the internet, or maybe it would be more appropriate to say it's like kind of an attempt to enforce a return to a more decentralized system. Like, it reminds me a lot of like the early architecture papers for the internet itself. Like, there's nothing here that prevents a lot of decentralization. There's a lot that allows decentralization, but I haven't really seen anything that works against it. So it's really hard to kind of see it, Bluesky, resisting those same pressures. In particular, I think, I don't know, I don't think it got talked about when Gordon Brandier was here, I don't think it got talked about. They talked about it, but it was mentioned in their newsletter. But this idea that probably user identity is a place of future centralizations in decentralized systems. And I think that's very obvious here. Like their current DID system, like it's kind of interesting that they're like, oh, well, we can do handles off DNS, which is a questionable decision, but it is a decentralized. It's a system with many parties. That hasn't exactly proven itself super trustworthy, but it's still very decentralized-ish for the current web. But their current DLD system is actually kind of rooted in their own server, and they kind of have this hand wavy. Well, we're talking about a lot of a consortium of operators there, but it's really unclear what the path forward is to doing anything with that. And I think the best case is it winds up just looking like DNS and probably getting absorbed into the DNS providers, which is not a great outcome, in my opinion. I think otherwise it feels like there's a lot of this that feels like somebody looked at Mastodon and was like, okay, what if Mastodon, but we were actually serious about decentralization instead of like creating fiefdoms. So kind of like, again, going back to those early internet days, but kind of saying, hey, single servers were kind of, and like rooting things in single servers was sort of a mistake. So how do we not root things in single servers? But we don't want to actually go as far as saying this is a totally decentralized system, because that's hard, and frankly, there's a lot of bad blood with the few of those that actually exist right now. So what can we do in that? So it's sort of it feels much more like, let's take sort of the infrastructure of what we've had with the web and kind of do sort of like a 1.5 or a 2.0. There's a part of me that wants to be like, this is Web 2.0, not the social media stuff, because it's very much more looking back at the architectural portions of it. So I think, I think that's my main thoughts in what I've managed to get through in this, just hopping around. It feels more orthogonal to the blockchain space. I mean, think your prompt was about the advantages, disadvantages of this model compared to blockchains. And it just feels like this is much more not trying to build something new as trying. So it's much more sort of like a reformist rather than radical take, if you think of the blockchains as like a radical take there. And so it's much harder, I think, to compare them. I mean, the advantages of this is that it's much easier to implement. I think the disadvantage is that it's really not clear how this prevents the same lock-in and capture in the end, and it's not really obvious how this prevents censorship from migrating down the stack again. Whereas I feel like the blockchain people have given much, much more thought to this sort of thing. You could kind of imagine a world where some of this was swapped out for more blockchainy stuff, like DIDs could be rooted in blockchains. You could have, probably not technically blockchains, but you could create sort of a validator system that looked more like, a little bit more like what Ethereum is doing. These are not the same, but they kind of rhyme a little bit. So you could imagine kind of moving in that direction and using some of the work on the blockchain side to create some censorship-resistant mechanisms, incentives for actually including things at the sort of the fire hose level, and really actually letting the labelers and the feed aggregators do their thing, rather than having content removal happen for closer down the stack. But I think, given the general hostility towards blockchains. I'm not sure I see that happening before you see in this market, assuming it even takes off. So those are my thoughts. I will pass up to Grigori.
To me, it looks like they have a strong imagination. The problem I see with the whole article is actually perfectly summarized in a first sentence. It's kind of true, but read it again. I will read it loud. Over the last 2 decades, it's important. Social media services have evolved from a fun curiosity into a cornerstone of a civic life. And this contrast between fun curiosity and the cornerstone of a civic life is also important. So the timing is important. This distinction between curiosity and the cornerstone is important. Whether you believe that social media is indeed at this moment a cornerstone of a civic life or not. So it's a very packed phrase. But if you look at it with a critical eye, you will find that Bluesky is not a cornerstone of a civic life. It's probably on a fun curiosity phase of development. So for it to try to solve the problems of the cornerstones is kind of pointless because it is not. So what can be interesting is to look back at what kind of problems social media services were obsessed with when they were on the same stage as Bluesky is now. And I strongly believe, I didn't have time to look, that this problem of running out of useful handles definitely were not a problem they were obsessed with back then. This problem of running out of handles happens when you have a few billion users, not a few million. Moreover, even if you believe that this is a problem you have to handle as fast as you possibly can from the get-go, if you solve it, you will reach the scale of Facebook much faster than whatever happened to Facebook. If you believe that, then it can be a useful reminder that no service can promise you to keep your handle forever. Because the legal rights to the names, handles, are settled outside of the service. So you have a legal system, and this legal system can decide whether you have the right to a particular handle or somebody else can kick you out of. And I give you an example, like if I drink a lot of Coca-Cola, I can imagine myself trying to register handle Coca-Cola on some sort of a service, social media service, because I love Coca-Cola and I drink a lot of. But then via legal means, it will be shown to me that no, actually, I don't have the right name, even if I'm unaware of the consequences. But the service cannot keep track of all the names that they are taking and all the attempts that people are trying to do, and especially they cannot handle all the future cases when I don't know, some rights have expired and somebody else claims them, or so on and so forth. So your claim to the handle can always be challenged, and it can always be challenged outside the service or outside the protocol. And then the protocol will have to comply. So they cannot promise you the handle. And that, in my view, is kind of important. But then again, if you believe that to get to a scale of Facebook as now will take, I don't know, a couple of decades for Bluesky, then probably they will have bigger problems to solve in 2 decades from now. So it's unclear that solving this problem now will give the users of Bluesky some tangible benefit now or in the future. So for me, it's an attempt to pretend that they are as big as Twitter or Facebook, but they are apparently not as big. So it feels like it's a PR stunt, not a serious conversation. But again, I am not a very technical person. Maybe I'm wrong. And I will pass it on to Adam.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I share some of the thoughts about Gregory and Nathan shared. There's a lot going on here, but I hadn't quite looked at the technical architecture of Bluesky before. But while I was reading through this, it just kind of struck me that this is creating a sort of a social media or a social networking, decentralized social networking layer seems like an impossible problem with like many different compromises that one has to take. The design decisions that Bluesky took was interesting with their own what they call as PDS, like personal data server, where every user gets a server. It's currently hosted at Bluesky, but in the future, apparently, the protocol allows for different service providers to build a server and manage it, or if they just have their own server. I thought the design decision of having the user's own repository interesting, like the idea of repository where, like, if a user follows another user, that data is stored in this repository and it's not really stored on the other user's repository. So in order to calculate all the followers of a particular account, you kind of have to index all the servers. I thought that was interesting bit of information in sort of self-sovereignty, where like you as a user, you're not really entitled to have a copy of all of your followers. It's really the networks, which I thought was interesting. It reminded me of the other piece of this, the design philosophy of this paper reminded me of the Jay Greber's other article of Web3 self-certifying, where the only type of certifications that happens is on the content. And I also found it interesting that they chose to rely on DNS and email for that. Like they explicitly call out that users are not comfortable storing their cryptographic key, so we are going to have them use email to recover their accounts and attach that to their cryptographic key, which is what used to generate a hash for their DID document. I thought that was an interesting choice in that we would, to me, ideally, at least the promise of Web3 and the promise of having a decentralized system is sort of this use of, I think as previously others have identified here, as the use of this public key cryptography system that users can have in their phone. So it seems like resorting to an old system that is known for a bunch of issues already, and it's sort of got an oligopoly of sorts. Seemed interesting in that we, instead of looking for ways to make that system better, are allowing for easy user recovery. And just relying on the old system was interesting, but yeah, and also the sort of decentralization is kind of like a bastardized word in the recent times, but it's kind of, to me at least, it seems the most important aspect of decentralization is not just having not a single point of failure, but having no points of failure at all. But there are multiple design constraints that they've chosen where there is possibility of that failure here. So it'll be interesting to see how it evolves from here. And yeah, I mean, I like they called out their assessment of Farcaster and other social protocols was pretty on point. So I thought that was good. And in terms of advantages of over blockchains or this, it seems like blockchains are not really meant for having a social networking layer like this, but I really like what Farcaster tried to do, where it's just like 3 smart contracts, and then you build your own sort of hub layer on top of that. So you're not really fully reliant on blockchain, but at the same time, you're relying on it for some base level credible neutrality and sort of decentralization of usernames and so on and so forth. So I thought that was interesting that blockchains could act as this credible layer, which I guess I didn't directly find in this this Bluesky paper. But I'll stop there. I'll pass it to Venkat.
Yeah, I think I'm still struggling to understand these systems at a sufficient level of detail to make too many precise comparisons. But a couple of things I think are already kind of clear. So decentralization and censorship resistance of the names, I think we've touched upon. In one case, here in Bluesky, it relies on DNS. In Farcaster, it relies on a mix of ENS, and for people who are not willing to pay for ENS, I guess you're sort of like making the trade-off and paying or relying on the Farcaster team's centralized trustworthiness. I'm not quite sure how the two regimes are mixed and matched. So that's something I think is worth looking into. But yeah, if you just compare DNS to ENS, I think ENS is more censorship resistant, as I was posting in the comments. I don't think a court can like take away your ENS until it actually expires by the date on the contract. And Anuraj asked whether if two parties disputing an ENS name are in the same jurisdiction, can something be done? I don't know. I think it can only just be locally blocked. If other places, other countries in the world want to recognize an ENS, it'll still continue. So I think local blackouts are possible, but overall, if you own an ENS name, you kind of own it. But this is something I think we should have a read on the ENS. So that's one key difference. The other key difference is I don't think Bluesky has thought through the economic incentives challenge. So Farcaster is already charging the equivalent of $5 somewhere in the system. I actually don't know how that works, since I think I, like most of you, joined Farcaster before that regime started. So we are all grandfathered in, and we don't know how the payment scheme works. I know it does take a payment to start a new Farcaster account, and that's on Optimism, and it does takes like $5 plus like a few pennies in transaction fees. But I don't know who the money sort of like technically goes to. Like right now, of course, it goes to the Whatcast team as the main sign-on or on-ramp, but there are other on-ramps, and I think if you sign up through like Supercast or one of the other clients, maybe they get the money. So I don't know if it goes to clients or if it goes to hubs that are doing the storage, or whether there's some scheme for like sharing the money among the hub schemes. But it looks like they've at least thought of economic incentives at that level. But I think Bluesky does make me wonder about higher levels of incentives, like their indexing layers and relay and firehose layers. These are much more computationally intensive than running PDSs in the case of Bluesky or hubs in the case of Farcaster. And it's not clear what incentives there are at that level. So if there's, in a future state, if there's like a million Bluesky PDSs or a million Farcaster hubs, it's not clear to me if I'm running like an indexing service and publishing a firehose, how I'm supposed to make money. So this intermediate level aggregation stuff is still costly. Like if you rely on subscription fees, you're kind of like a backbone layer. But I think, yeah, the blockchain people have gone farther along in thinking through the economic problems, but they're still not anywhere near done. So both have a lot more work to do. And I think Bluesky has thought through it a little bit less. Censorship resistance overall, yeah, I think, ENS versus DNS definitely advantage blockchain. But other layers of censorship resistance, I think they're about actually equal. So you can, if you don't like a client, you can make your own client on both. If you don't like your PDS, you can switch PDSs, and in the case of Farcaster, you can switch hubs. So that seems about the same. So if you kind of think through like a full use case of censorship resistance, if you simply don't like where you are now, it looks like the solution in both cases is to take your data and go to actually, you don't even need to explicitly do that in the blockchain case, I think. If you start pointing your client to a different hub, it seems to me that everything should happen automatically in the background. Whereas in the case of Bluesky, it sounds like you kind of have to do some extra stuff, like take your data off of one PDS and put it onto another. So that part is not clear. This is where I'm not comfortable with my level of like technical clarity on what exactly is happening here. But I think overall, all these things are much more censorship resistant than the traditional web, in the sense that there are fewer actors in the value chain who can like stop you doing what you want. And those fewer actors have less leverage in the things they can do to you. And you have more recourses if you don't like what they're doing, like backing up and moving and stuff. Like even with the DNS stuff, if a local country's government decides that you're a bad actor and, I don't know, somehow screws up the DNS system and takes control of your DNS-based name, it sounds like the rest of your presence on Bluesky is safe. The data is there, you can take it off a PDS, you can move to a different country, upload it to a different PDS, and probably just start a new DNS name and reclaim that entire history. So the association between you, the human user, and your activity history is not dependent on the name, because the name is not, I think, the actual pointer. You kind of have like cryptographic control over your history independently of the name you have. That's the sense I get. But again, I don't know actually how to, in practice, do all this. Like, can I recover some sort of private key that represents my Bluesky archive access and keep that secure, maybe in a different country, so that if the government takes away my account or something, I can move and like basically resurrect my account? I don't know how to do that. So all these things, I think, theoretically are opening up a lot of optionality. It remains to be seen how much in practice they're usable. And I think of the three questions: censorship resistance, economic viability. So a lot of censorship resistance is not technical, but economic, because if the economic incentives aren't right, and your resistance depends on like there being more than one player at a given level of infrastructure, it's basically not censorship resistance if there's not enough incentives. So if there's only one indexer, you basically don't have censorship resistance at the indexer level. So economics is actually censorship resistance in disguise. And the third part is the one I don't see either actually addressing any better or at all. But actually, ActivityPub does address it to some extent, which is changing user culture. So right now, almost all the accounts on Bluesky are through the bluesky.social or whatever the standard default domain is. So it's like most users, even I have it. Like I have multiple domains. I could easily update DNS records, but it's just enough extra friction that I haven't bothered to point my Bluesky account to something else. So, and as far as I can tell, I haven't like really explored people publishing or consuming different feeds, but I don't. I haven't bothered to look into how I would publish my own feed. Maybe I have a few other feeds in my top bar, but I mostly rely on the basic feed. So I haven't. I've been extremely lazy, and I think most users are going to be even lazier. So you need a level of technical literacy to actually use any of these infrastructure things in I don't know, non-trivially censorship-resistant and interesting ways, and most people are not going to do that. So that's actually, I think, the problem we are trying to solve at the Summer of Protocols level, which is can you increase protocol literacy in the population? So regardless of which of these new systems they're using, they're kind of literate and aware enough of what these things actually are, so they're aware of what agency they have. Like, there are nodes or hubs or PDSs, so people know about it and what that means and what they might be able to do with them. So that's one literacy challenge. The other literacy challenge is more like civic and governance, citizenship rights type literacy, which is valuing your agency enough and actually exercising it as a motive in itself, right? Like in a true democracy, you kind of have opinions of voting is important, and even if you kind of don't care for any of the candidates, you might believe as a value that democracy is based on votes and I have to go vote even if it doesn't mean anything, right? So that's not so much a literacy as kind of like an ideological commitment to a system. And I think that kind of change is going to be extremely slow with these systems. It's like, all right, I might appreciate the point of censorship resistance in the abstract, and I might even technically know how to do some of these things, but I might not care enough to actually exercise any of that agency because I don't have the values required, right? Just like many people, almost everybody in democratic countries these days, they get voting. They get how democracy works. They get the mechanics of voting. They kind of get how campaigning is done and whether politicians are corrupt. But many people still kind of just don't care about voting. They're like, my vote doesn't matter. I'm not going to vote. So it's that problem, I think, has not been addressed at all. But anyway, I'll stop there. A lot to chew on here, and I think if you can find good reads on ENS and stuff, we should dig deeper in this direction. Back to Anuraj, if you want to unmute and speak, you can now.
Like I couldn't read the whole protocol and understand it technically, but it seemed that one of the primary goals of the protocol design is like content moderation. It's like they want to use some sort of decentralization uh, for like content moderation. It's like it feels like a rebellion to the Twitter completely free speech stuff. It feels like a alternative. They are trying to have a rebellion against what Twitter is doing. But yeah, like I don't know how much, because they still have to solve the money problem, and like I don't know how that is solved, because they have just I read somewhere that says like the users can easily run a small pub or a small server for this, but then it seems like it will end up like Mastodon and like for useful for running small subcultures or like small servers. But like if they want to if this protocol has to scale, then how is the money problem solved? I didn't see any discussion regarding that. And like by completely getting rid of blockchain, they have lost a lot of affordances that could have basically allowed them to uh, solve the money problem. I'm just speculating, but like that is something like yeah, those were my thoughts.
Yeah, the moderation problem, I think they've already gone through like one bloody war about that. Like I think about a year ago, a bunch of like Nazis started joining, and then there was a huge panic about Nazis joining, and there was a big war, and both sides made it kind of impossible to use Bluesky for a while. And one of the interesting things that popped up was the people who were demanding that the suspected Nazi accounts be deplatformed and so forth, they were expecting Twitter-style moderation. They were expecting like a centralized model where Bluesky would take like action to globally shut down everything. And there was almost like perverse resistance to acquiring the literacy to how these things technically will work in these systems. It was like they were saying, fuck you, I don't care what decentralization and federation and all that means. I just want you to do this. And if you don't do it, I'm going to like use all my power to destroy you. That was kind of the general attitude that was on display. And I think that actually damaged Bluesky for a bit. And there was a lot of like exit, like a big groups came on and then left immediately when they didn't like how Mastodon responded. So I think, yeah, they didn't like set out to be a rebellion against Twitter in terms of moderation, but it ended up being that, I think, because technically they couldn't do what some users were asking, and in the end they were forced to like double down on this sort of alt model. But I think that's something that's going to shake out over the long term. But yeah, I'm still not convinced that blockchains offer any more affordances for solving the economic incentive problems. Like they offer better payment rails and like payment distribution mechanisms, but the incentive design problem still remains unsolved. Like I still, in either blockchain or non-blockchain cases, I don't think anybody has figured out how to incentivize hub or PDS operators to, I don't know, do more than run like unreliable small scale hobby things. Whereas I think in the core L1 blockchain, that problem to some extent has been solved, right? Like you've got staking pools and stuff that allow the consensus layer to be meaningfully economically independent. But those ideas haven't like percolated up to L2s or these application level ecosystems. So yeah, I think lots of problems need to still be solved. Any more thoughts? Last couple of minutes. All right. If not, next week it'll be Anant with a more general distributed systems reading. And just as a reminder, we are alternating loosely crypto-ish kind of reads with non-crypto-ish distributed computing reads. So yeah, Anant will be next week. See you guys next week.
Thank you. See you guys.